With your help, we can continue to fight for freedom, reach new audiences, and bring important information to the public free of charge. This is not possible without your generosity. Join our quest for the truth and our freedom and donate today, telling it as it is. This is today's News Talk, The World Today.
Makers are facing more travel.
When we're on the go, it's easy to go into our own world. Keep your mind on the road.
Our beautiful world is changing, withering, dying by the hands of those who don't value nature, even though we all depend on it for life itself. But there is hope. Together with caring friends, the Nature Conservancy can restore our lands, heal our waters, and save our wildlife with big solutions only nature can provide. But every day we lose more of the places we love, and we urgently need to save endangered lands, waters, and wild species. The actions we take today will determine the tomorrow we leave to our children and grandchildren. The water they drink, the air they breathe, the beauty they experience. To learn more about how you can help protect and conserve our beautiful world, visit nature.org today.
Asthma is a growing problem, especially among children. Asthma affects the quality of life for millions like me every single day. My name is Chris Draft, and I have asthma. And I've spent more than a decade in the NFL tackling asthma on and off the field. Join me in the EPA in helping people control their asthma. Asthma is a lung condition that can be controlled through medication and by avoiding things that can make it worse. 3 steps are the solution to controlling asthma. Step 1, talk to a doctor. Step 2, make a plan. And step 3, get rid of things that can make it worse. Asthma can be tackled. For more information on asthma, log on to epa.gov/asthma.
We're today's News Talk, The World Today.
And welcome to the Protagonists. Today we're looking at warp speed fallacies. And it's a nice cozy panel too, by the way. It's been more than 5.5 years since the Covid19 pandemic was declared. We've had several COVID inquiries, a royal commission in New Zealand where final findings are yet to be released, but to which politicians were spared a public hearing. The UK's inquiry's second report found last week that the government should have acted even sooner and gone in harder to save lives. That is warped. A pandemic response was not as effective as it could have been, and many of the measures would no longer be acceptable. Hardly a ringing endorsement. It was just a disgrace, wasn't it? The truth is, these findings paper over devastating government actions and tell us little that we don't know. There is little in these findings on the malfeasance and the negligence of our regulatory bodies. Maybe it shouldn't be mind-blowing that a drug with poor or insufficient safety testing was imposed on whole populations. It's been third world countries, hasn't it? Never ending. I feel like we're living on the moon sometimes. Why did this happen? How did this happen? What were the real consequences? Why has no one been made responsible for the high cost of the pandemic, which governments do acknowledge in their big, expensive reports? The vax injured and the dead are sadly referred to just as victims of the pandemic. However, lots of public health officials and prime ministers have moved on with royal honours, rich pensions and cushy jobs. Their enablers, the journalist, mainstream media and the epidemiologist, they all took the payola. Our panellists today will help sort us out and sort the, what can we say, sort the poo from the clay, to put it crudely, highlighting issues left out of government inquiries. Where were the medical regulators? Were they negligent? And what was Operation Warp Speed? Was it a magnificent fallacy and a very apt name for cutting corners to deliver a drug that was never? Sure, changes have been made, but should the drug be on the market at all? Will a decision finally come when it's too late? Well, after the carpetbaggers have gone. Our guest today, we think we have three, but we could possibly have two. We have Dr. Matt Shelton, founding member of NZDSOS. I think the guides have been kind to us. We have Hedley Rees, and Dr. Peter Johnson, a retired GP and victim of APRA. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Hedley, your computer is now working. Isn't that great? Now, I just want to ask you all, and just to give me a brief summary of where we are in each of our respective countries, because Matt, you're in New Zealand, Hedley in the UK, and Peter, you're in Australia. Matt, first of all, just a brief overview of where we're at the moment in New Zealand.
Good evening all. We are near the end of actually the second Royal Commission. The first one had very narrow terms of reference and wouldn't look at the issues around vaccine safety or effectiveness or procurement. But following the election and the new government, an election promise was honoured, and we have broader terms of reference, and the period of submission, 30,000 written submissions, and 1 week of public hearings, and then an aborted second week, which you referred to, where relevant politicians refused to attend. So that's being written up madly, presumably before the summer break, and it's intended to be released early February next year. So there's been some interesting comments made. They seem to acknowledge the fact of vaccine injuries, but have been kind of careful to say, well, our job is to look at the government's responsibility in any of that. And for instance, as we were asked directly when we showed up, should the expert advice they were given by external advisors, should the government be held responsible for any of that advice that they have in the end been wrong or caused harm? So we think we can see where this is going, and we're doing our best just to keep shouting to the chief seats and demanding accountability and demanding that the vaccine be withdrawn. There are still some soft mandates, as far as we can tell, in the health system. It's sort of ad hoc, but in law, it's clear that they're not actually able to require anybody to take any vaccinations, but they're still being recommended. There's money being spent on adverts on the radio and the telly, etc. So a lot of people are wanting to move on, and politicians are telling us that we should move on. But there's a large number of people who are completely stuck in their lives with vaccine injuries and really extreme disablement in some cases, who are being ignored by a health system that's overwhelmed and just falling apart. Frankly, Rome seems to be burning, and there's no acknowledgement about this. And in fact, they're doubling down and making beating infectious disease a priority, and intending to get most of the adults vaccinated as well as the children against various things. And we have an alleged measles outbreak. So the MMR is front and center of the propaganda at the moment.
Hedley Rees, Managing Director at and lead consultant at PharmaFlow. Can you tell me the overview at the moment in the UK? I mean, we have New Zealand. We're going to find out about Australia in a second. How are things in the UK? Are they just as hysterical as before, or is there more of a pushback?
Morning, Mike. Well, my wife works in the local hospital, and they're back wearing masks this week. And You see people in supermarkets, nothing like what it was, but you see the odd person wearing a mask, and this scaremongering is still going on. We've got this link between the UK Health Security Department, used to be run by Jenny Harris, now someone else is running it, but they're basically the marketing arm of the UK government, pushing, shingles and all these different vaccines. And it's now gone into overdrive because obviously they can see they're losing ground, and so they should be. So I just want to get my supply chain knowledge and skills out there to basically convince people once and for all that this was a complete scam, dreamt up by the pharmaceutical industry and particularly UK government and various other parts of the UK government. So my pitch on this is that this was a UK centered global initiative coming from GlaxoSmithKline staff. I'll say more about this as we chat. So I'm just looking forward to, to this discussion.
And Dr. Peter Johnson, a retired GP, enjoying the golf course, especially the 19th hole, and victim of ARPA, just so he can get over that time. That 19th is good. By the way, that's my favourite hole. It's my favourite hole. Peter, what's the overview in Australia at the moment? Now we know, or for those who aren't familiar, Peter lives in the one of the new territories of China. It's called. It's a terrible part of the world at the moment. If you could just tell me, Peter, the overview at the moment with regards to what the other two gentlemen have been saying.
Yeah, look, thanks. Nice to be here, Mike. I think we're still a bit of a backwater here. Before the 22 election, the Prime Minister promised a royal commission on COVID, but once in power, he ran very rapidly away from it and instituted a potential, what he was hoping would be a total whitewash of an inquiry that couldn't bring in state premiers. In the end, the three people he had for the commission, two of whom were complicit in the actual lockdowns and management of COVID, even they couldn't resist saying that the management of the state premiers was appalling. However, not much came out beyond that, and now we're sort of back. The Labor Party's won again, and it's sort of nothing to see here, and let's push on. So, unfortunately, there's not much. No one being held responsible, and I think they've all been promoted or given their honours, and there we are. Yeah,
it's pretty sad. This is just off moving it left field from the script at the moment. It's pretty sad. No one's been held accountable. I mean, there have been a numerous amount of deaths, and in fact, millions upon millions around the world, and we have those that are maimed. I haven't seen one prosecution. If someone can just, if they have, if they could let me know, because at the moment it seems like the baddies have got away with it, and it's because the other baddies have a bit like a Custer's last stand, but we're the ones doing the last standing bit. Matt, can I ask you, were people dying at a faster rate than the flu? You need to probably hit your microphone, Matt. That little button there.
Do you mean when we had COVID or following the vaccine rollout? Because we didn't get COVID.
Yeah,
we didn't get COVID till after the vaccine rollout started. Really, there were sort of the one followed the other, because we sort of kept influenza out, and we actually had a less than the normal death rate in 2020. But then things took off, and at one stage we were up 30% in excess deaths over the sort of 2015 to 2019 averages, and that was taking into account slight population growth, which stalled obviously when the country was locked down and then people couldn't come back. But I mean, the papers are full of stories of young people dying of influenza, and particularly cancer. And that's very, very clear. And of course, they trot out experts, and we've just had two, very reasonable cancer surgeons, both specializing in the gut, talking about the undoubted epidemic or significant increase anyway of bowel cancer in younger patients, but expressing befuddlement and suggesting everything, of course, except the bloody vaccine. And it's this sort of general befuddlement and this kind of mass determination to keep heads in the sand and to turn away by previously reasonable people. Like I know both of these surgeons who are both basically spokesmen for organizations here that speak for bowel cancer and things. And I used to refer to both of them when I lived in Christchurch, when I was a doctor down there. Now I'm not currently able to practice. I'm still on the register by my fingernails, but I'm not speaking as a currently practicing doctor. But I've been around the tracks and can attest to what I've seen, and my thousands of hours now of personal study into all this sort of thing. So not even the papers are denying that there are these horror stories, and still the old young person or sports person who dies suddenly, and they can't resist talking about it in the media outlets. But there's never a question or somebody reasonable saying, well, look, this is happening a lot, isn't it? We really need to look at the likely cause. So there's still this collective blindness and deafness and amnesia as to what everybody took in 2021, 2022 to a quite farcical extent. And it would be funny, it would be like a classic British Ealing comedy farce of some sort if people weren't dying and being maimed. And it's not getting any better. And our worst fear, of course, is that this thing's going to be exponential, and we're just at the beginning of it becoming more and more visible. And at some point, it will be obvious to everybody. But Hedley and Peter are right. At this stage, nobody's been hauled into court. There are some actions that are brewing, and there's some that have been tried. And of course, these things take a long time. And I think there is a momentum building of committed people trying to use the court processes that they still have to get some accountability.
Hedley, who should be held accountable? You have your views on this. Is it the usual suspects, or are there others that we really haven't been focusing on all that much over the last couple of years?
Yeah, I think the spotlight's been on the wrong areas. It's been on what's in the injections, SV40 and plasmids and lipid nanoparticles. But this was a supply chain malfeasance, and it is the responsibility of the regulators to make sure that every material in those injections are squeaky clean. And they have to make sure that all the sites making stuff have been inspected, with rigor. And the regulatory authorities just have gone AWOL through all of this. And I'm not just talking about the UK, I'm talking about the FDA, I'm talking about TGA, I'm talking about all the regulators, because they were captured by Bill Gates and the World Health Organization in 2012, when the WHO decided to set up a duplicate regulatory authority called the International Coalition for Medical Regulatory Authorities, which was self-elected, and it basically captured the world's regulatory authorities, the formal ones, the ones that we've been used to in the last 60 years. They all joined the Bill Gates Club. European Medicines Agency leadership, Emma Cook, who's there now, she's the chair of that organization, and she's the chair of the European Medicines Agency. Now, how much of a conflict of interest is that? So this has all been the pharmaceutical industry, the big pharma companies, who are not now able to bring drugs to market because they sold all the facilities to do that to third parties. So they're at the whim of these contractors who are making the drugs for them. They get paid whether the drug gets to market or not. We've got this huge patent cliff now, where the big pharma companies, they're looking around for anything that can replace the products they were selling, which are now out of patent. And the latest feeding frenzy is these obesity drugs, the GLP-1s, which really aren't, I don't think, adding a lot to humanity, because absolutely for anyone who's obese under the doctor's monitoring, yes, absolutely. But we're seeing these drugs being taken by all sorts of people who really don't need to lose weight. And the other thing is, there are no long-term studies. There should be. Whenever you launch a drug, you should run phase 4 studies when the drug is in market. And these don't happen anymore. Quietly, they've all stopped doing them. So we don't know the long-term safety of any drug when it's in the market, let alone the obesity ones, or particularly not the vaccines. So I don't know if that helps, Mike.
So, okay, so if we don't know, basically, then the whole thing is just failing miserably, and it's placing everybody in danger. Hedley, I'm just going to keep this with you at the moment. What can we do about it?
Well, first of all, we absolutely have to stop these gene modified cell therapies using CRISPR. CRISPR is it's a long it's a long word, but it's a gene editing technology where you take an animal cell and you convert it into what they call the spike protein, where you actually sort of create what they call a plasmid, which is this small strip of DNA that goes into your body. And there's a theory that is going to help someone. Now, it is a complete theory, been in development since 1960, that long, and they only recently come to market as these caramic antigen receptor T cell therapies, which again are just a theory. The supply chain is dangerous. They've never been able to conquer numbers of the issues with the cold chain, with the fact that they can become contaminated in the blink of an eye. All these things have been ignored. And we've got to get the regulators back into doing their job. And I've said before, Mike, signs are the FDA, with the new guys in charge, are getting on top of this. Inspections have become a lot more intense. Overseas inspections now, they can turn up at a minute's notice, whereas they used to give 6 weeks notice. And the FDA is getting back to where it was as the gold standard. It's going to take time, and Robert Kennedy Jr. is getting a lot of heat, and that's obviously because he fired Peter Marks, who was the head of the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Review, who was the guy who was waving through all these therapies. He was going to conferences all over the world on gene therapies, and he basically was part of the whole gene therapy network. And when he fired Peter Marks from FDA, I think that was a huge plus. And the people there we've got now, Marty Makari, we've got Vinay Prasad, who's now taken over from Marks, and he had a lot to say about the dangers of these vaccines. And we've just got another the head of CEDA, but it's going to take time. The people who left the FDA, a lot of them are not happy. So there's a lot of push, and numbers of them have gone to legal firms. So there is a lot of pushback. But we can only do this through the regulators, and because the European Medicines Agency is compromised, MHRA is absolutely compromised, because the guy now who's chair of the MHRA was the co-chair of the Joint Committee for Vaccines and Immunisation in the UK. And the previous guy, I've been going through this, the SAGE group, the JCVI, all these various bodies in the UK. You had people such as, I've forgotten his name now. The Wellcome Trust guy, who went to the WHO as chief scientific officer. Jeremy Farrar, that's it. I knew that came to me. You know, all these people are started in the UK, and they've gone to. We know with Warp Speed, the guy who advised Donald Trump was a GSK 30-year executive who'd been developing vaccines in Africa and very other parts. He advised Donald Trump on Warp Speed. He was also on the board of the company that made these injections, Lonza, contract manufacturer, and he was also on the board of Moderna. So you can imagine what sort of advice that guy was given. His name is Monsif Slaoui. And in the UK, the head of the vaccine task force was Sir Richard Sykes, a massive figure in pharma, a masterminded two huge acquisitions of Wellcome and SmithKline Beecham, and it became the biggest company in the world. But when Glaxo in the it was initially Glaxo in the 1990s. It was the number one pharmaceutical in the world company. After probably $200 billion of mergers, it's just hanging on to the top 10 in the world. I think it's just gone out of that. So GSK was going down the pan, is going down the pan. And, you know, you could argue, I argue that these vaccines were just a rebranding of these CAR T therapies that already existed in development since 2013. And I was part of that development as a consultant to the company that made the AstraZeneca vaccine, which wasn't AstraZeneca. It was a company called Oxford Biomedica, based in the UK, in Cowley. I spent 6 months there in 2013, helping them get a UK government grant. And when they got the grant, there was an organization set up then by UK government called the Medicines Manufacturing Industry Partnership, which was which reported into the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry and the Bioindustry Association. And they set about then basically developing these CAR T therapies. They set up the cell and gene therapy catapult with a mission to get these therapies into the world. And here we are now. We've seen that they weren't getting anywhere, so they basically rebranded those CAR T therapies as vaccines, and suddenly Pfizer made $80 billion in the first year. Moderna is a tiny company. I don't know how it's, well, you know, Moderna's been set up. Moderna and Biotech were set up as new kids on the block. These companies, they can develop a drug in 12 months. No, sorry, you're just pretending that. So the big pharma companies, and they did all collaborate together because they all have the same issue, which they can't bring drugs to market and their patents are running out. So I hope that helps.
It does, and we have in Australia, Peter. Please don't hold back. Tell us about the TGA.
Yes, the TGA. It's interesting that this week there was a letter from. It was actually from Marianne Damasi, who's been doing some great work, I think. Marianne succeeded in getting an article into the BMJ about how the degree of capture of the organisations that are meant to be protecting us, and which Hedley's already mentioned earlier. But our Australian TGA topped the list with 96% of its income comes from the pharmaceutical companies it's meant to be policing us on. When it comes to COVID, there was no evidence that they actually ever did do any proper vetting of these drugs. And I think they just took the FDA's advice. I can't prove that, but the TGA was meant to, because it was this was a drug. The COVID vaccines were really only given on emergency use basis. Then the TGA was promised enhanced safety monitoring. But 4 years later, they admit they've never systematically tracked whether they kept that promise. So what became as a straightforward request for transparency has resulted in rather extraordinary contradictions. And Marianne Damasi has made a quick note of what happens when they ask for freedom of information from the TGA as to how they've been doing this backup. They were told documents don't exist in February 2022. In July 2022, they were told ample documents exist. In September 2024, successfully they'd organised thousands of documents for the Commissioner, but then in June 2025, they couldn't use the same systems for the citizens because it was too subjective. And then in October last month, vast volumes exist, but producing them would be too difficult, yet very happy to receive freedom of information requests. And I think Marianne Damasi summed it up saying it's like Escher's famous staircase, we keep climbing, but we never arrive anywhere. And I think whenever you see the people from FDA, from the TGA, under questioning in Senate Senate inquiries, all they ever seem to say is, "We'll take it on notice."
It's terrible. Matt, Hedley just mentioned that basically the vaccine was just a redeveloped older one, but in a nutshell. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, there's more than enough evidence to show that this whole thing was ready to go way before we were all supposed to think. I mean, Moderna set up a joint venture with the CIA in 2012, which was the same year that the US Air Force, I think it was, said that they were committing to the mRNA platform for their sort of future biodefense needs, and the money started coming in. One of the first things I did with all this was in May 2020, and I went on with John Campbell, and it was quite an upbeat interview because it was becoming clear that it was the IFR was equivalent to a moderate flu, that we knew who the high risk groups were, and there was strong evidence for vitamin D and zinc and quercetin, and the treatment evidence was coming in, hydroxychloroquine. This was kind of before the fake studies to try and discredit those things. But we both agreed and sort of dismissed the idea that we'd need to wait for a vaccine, because there were treatments that were likely to help, and that traditionally these things came and went through the different countries in about 6 weeks. But also that clearly, it would take years for, the safety and I'd hate to use the word effectiveness of whatever vaccine might turn up, to prove itself. So naively, we had no idea that at that moment they were, of course, in the throes of planning the clinical trial to get these things approved. And at the end of it, out comes Moderna and Pfizer. And it was curious back then that the other big conglomerates that should have seen a feeding frenzy for a possible vaccine, like Glaxo, like AstraZeneca, etc., didn't throw their hat in the ring. And of course, when you understand the sort of the ownership structure, how they all own each other, and they're all owned by the big three companies that own everything essentially, that's no surprise. But out comes the Pfizer with 30 micrograms, and then the Moderna has 100 micrograms. There were no visible phase 1, phase 2 sort of dosing studies to refer to, and clearly early on, the Moderna seemed to be more associated with particularly myocarditis in young men and boys, and it stayed like that. It's still 3 times the dose of the supposed active ingredient. They've played around with buffers and tried to keep essentially ploughing ahead despite absolute silence. And we've spoken about this, all of us have spoken about this before, from the regulators who, we were promised would keep a beady eye out because it was a brand new technology. Well, it wasn't, as Hedley's explained. It was a failed technology that they'd never managed to get working, and was already known to be dangerous in some respects, and didn't have anywhere near the specificity that they were claiming. Off-target effects for Africa. And at the moment in New Zealand, we are demonstrating against our impending gene technology bill that promises to further deregulate, remove any responsibility actually from our regulator. All that's got to happen is that 2 overseas jurisdictions have got to approve something, and a single proposed regulator will be legally obligated to see it through here. And this isn't just human medicines. This is meddling around with plants and animals and things. So there's a sort of a feeding frenzy at the prospect of this brave new world that is supposedly going to rescue our economy by turning us all into lab rats and removing any sort of vestiges of safety at all. I think we're all facing the same things, but this point about this collective international regulator of the regulatory agencies, has a parallel with what's also happened with the medical regulators, like our Medical Council and APRA and the GMC, have all been regulated by this crowd called the FSMB in the States. And they are actually facing, that group are facing a lawsuit shortly, which is quite exciting to see.
Before I get into Hedley, because I think Hedley has more to add to this, the lack of testing for safety by the regulators, was that mentioned in the latest Commission report, Matt?
Are you talking to me, our Royal Commission? Because the report hasn't come out.
But what about any inkling about it? There have obviously been toings and froings. Has anything ever been mentioned about the lack of testing by the regulators?
Well, it's widely held or assumed that the contract that Pfizer drove, this devil's bargain with the government, precluded any testing at all, and that whatever has happened has been theatre for public consideration. And they've maintained this sort of two-pronged response, which is, we're not seeing anything we didn't expect to see. And that also has been a lockstep response from other regulators around the world. We're not seeing anything. And that's a very suspicious comment, because we know they were expecting to see all the things that have happened. And they're also saying, but we're continuing to watch very closely. And it remains safe and effective. Words that will haunt these people in years to come, for certain. So they're just barefacedly ignoring their obligations, swanning around as if they're completely home and hosed, and as if maybe there are some laws that we don't know about that are protecting them.
Hedley, so can you answer me this, and I'd like you to extrapolate, by the way, but was this a con from Big Pharma with the government, or was it a con on their citizens by Big Pharma and the government?
Well, it certainly was a con. I can tell you my involvement, because as I said earlier, I was asked to consult on these gene-modified cell therapies in 2013 from a company in the UK, and that grant was called Advanced Manufacturing Supply Chain Initiative, and obviously I'd had a reputation then of having advanced skills in the supply chain, and basically the UK government, they've been issuing reports on life sciences for years, how UK is going to get to #1 in the world because they're going to have this fantastic life sciences capability, and they kept claiming that. And between the company who was making those gene therapies for AstraZeneca, and I believe they had involvement in the others as well, and the government saw this as a sort of getting them both up the greasy ladder of life sciences to become #1 in the world. So these injections had a huge political impact. The Office for Life Sciences in the UK was heavily involved, and from 2013 onwards, I knew these were very early stage drugs, and very experimental. They were actually making in what they call cell factories when I went there, first of all, which is they've got these plastic equipment, and they're growing cells in there, and everyone's doing all this stuff. And after the grant, they got these things called bioreactors, which are highly automated and scientifically and technically complex, which was a huge shift in the technology. And I'm sure they didn't really understand what was going to happen. But what I'm saying is the government and this mutual back scratching, and are you at all the government institutions? The NHS, the universities, particularly the universities, the Cell and Gene Therapy Catapult, other organisations, the Centre for Process Innovation, and we know that the whole Barnard Castle thing, where Dominic Cummings went along to the GSK manufacturing plant there, and 2 days later the Pfizer jab was approved. All these people had fingers in the pie because they could all see this benefiting themselves. I think Boris Johnson was a key factor here, because when Cummings went to Barnard Castle, the big GSK manufacturing plant, Boris Johnson went into hospital because he caught COVID and he was close to death. Oh dear. All this manipulation of the story was, and it was because the media were part of it, and no one had access to to the facts. I'm hoping you're getting a bit of access to the facts here, and yeah. So did that help? I don't know.
It does. But it's highly alarming too, isn't it, Peter? And you talked about the TGA. Were they conned by Big Pharma, or did they con along with Big Pharma and the government, the rest of Australia?
I think. Sorry. I think the con happened starting with America. I think because the drug. They were only investigating or checking the drug as a vaccine, not as a genetic modifying drug. And had it been properly classified as a genetically modified drug, much more trials and background would have been needed before you released it to the public. And I don't, as I said before, I think the TGA just said, "Oh, FDA's approved it, so here we go."
Hedley, you were going to say something. By the way, gentlemen, if you want to just jump in whenever you want to, my feelings will not be hurt. They call me rhinoceros skin. So please go ahead. Hedley, what were you going to say before?
Yeah, I was just going to say, going back to this organization that was set up by the WHO and Bill Gates in 2012, they captured the TGA, they captured all the regulatory authorities. You can go on the website and you can see the members of it. And there's hardly a regulatory authority that's not on there. Visa in Brazil, I don't think Japan. Well, maybe that. So that was how clever this was. They knew they had to take the regulators out, and they were infiltrated. And even now, the lady who runs the European Medicines Agency is chair of that organization as well. And the original chair who set it up was a guy called Ian Hudson, Dr. Ian Hudson, who was the chief executive of the MHRA up until 2019, when he went off to work for the Bill and Melinda Gates organization. And fortunately for him, he's retired now. But we've still got on his organization in Bill Gates' organization, Trevor Mundell, who is head of his drug development, and he was the head of R&D at Novartis, one of the biggest pharma companies in the world. So you can see the tentacles of all wrapped around the various bodies that could have done anything against this. And then, as you say, you've got the JCVI, you've got the SAGE group particularly, because you had Patrick Vallance, who was actually chairing these groups, and you had the UK government, the Cobra government. So you had Cummings, who was sitting on all these meetings that they were having about what's happening with COVID, etc. And it was all being manipulated at government level, and that is the real issue. And I do see the UK as being the pivotal in this whole thing, because the Medicines Manufacturing Industry Partnership is being basically promoted or reports into the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry, which is a global trade organization for the pharmaceutical industry, and the Bioindustry Association, which covers the genetic and biologics. So, when you piece this all together, it's like a giant octopus with tentacles grabbing hold of anything that's going to have any chance of finding out what's actually going on.
Matt, can I ask you, and I actually, years ago, and I often say, looking at different theories of what happened, one of those were which came first, the vaccine or COVID. And I'm using that loosely, by the way, inverted commas. I'm going to ask you what we've heard. Which came first, the vaccine or COVID?
Well, clearly there's been a sort of parallel, serpentine journey for all these things that probably goes back a lot further, actually, than we've mentioned here. And I've certainly followed the work of David Martin, who's done great work following patents, there's a lot of players, many of whom we haven't mentioned here. But I think of interest, to our listeners, and Peter will know a lot more about the local players. It's been the same in all these countries. We all know the names of our local, officials and the ministers, and the cheerleaders for this whole thing, and the talking heads that we all got sick of. Lying in their teeth to us, because this whole thing has been, a giant lie. More and more of that is coming out now. The huge false positive rate for the PCR swabs, and whatever they were supposed to be telling, even the 10 to 14%, who the heck knows? We've been lied to, and we all know who the liars are, because they've lied over and over in all forms of media. So in a way, we've actually got all the evidence we need to hold these people to account. The question will be, how to find a robust corner of the legal system, and in which country that's going to be successful, because we don't need to question anymore what happened. I think we all know. We know enough to know that people have been killed and injured, and they shouldn't have been, and that the people in our own jurisdictions were responsible for that. We can't go to the head of the beast necessarily, but we can deal with our own backyards. And I'm looking forward to seeing that happen. But it's going to require the support and the involvement of the people on the ground, in our respective countries.
Actually, you mentioned David Martin, and I thought it was interesting that I remember him saying that the vaccine and the patent for the vaccine was requested a day before the patent for the virus. To answer your original question,
Peter, can I ask you? I just want to know. Why hasn't someone taken these regulatory agencies to court, TGA, MHRA, and so forth? Why haven't they been taken to court? Because take away all the other stuff, which is, could be a great crime. Well, it is. It's a crime that's continuing on. But the initial thing is they haven't done any testing for safety. We've all, that no one's really denying that, because they relied on someone else to do it. Such as such as Big Pharma, and what could possibly go wrong there. Why haven't they taken these people to court? Why hasn't someone? I mean, government's not going to do it, of course. Otherwise, they'll be in the same box defending themselves. But I mean, just out there in general public land, because it would look almost like an open and shut case.
Well, in theory, but if it's any guide to Australia, all the doctors that have tried to fight their cases have lost, bar a couple. because the courts seem to be just as captured as the medical profession. I think that's part of the reason. So the media, government, the medical profession, the science profession, all captured. It's a very brilliant scam if you admire criminal activity.
Look, I'm a great fan of Star Trek, and I used to love it when they say Captain Warp Speed. Hedley, tell me about Operation Warp Speed. Actually, now tell us actually what it was in reality.
Yeah, well, as I say, these drugs were on the market, CAR T therapies, they weren't selling. The first one was approved by the FDA, and in 2014, these therapies were given fast track status by the FDA. Now, I don't know how that happened, but that was the key because 3 years later, the FDA, this is under the Peter Marks regime, the FDA approved Novartis's Kymriah, which is what they call a CAR T cell therapy. It's basically genetic engineering. That's what it is in its starkest sense. And it was $475,000 for one treatment. It's what they call an autologous treatment, which means it's patient specific. The supply chain is unworkable, is unmanageable because you have to ship these patient cells 400 miles down the road in liquid nitrogen. You have to spend 2 to 6 weeks converting them genetically. Then they have to go back to the hospital, and the chances of things going wrong are immense. But anyway, so there was, and then there's been 8 others of the similar type. I think they called CAR T therapies C19 or CD9, but they're well known as now having these issues, neurological toxicities, cytokine release syndrome, and secondary cancers. Yeah. So there's a FDA black box warning on them, and they knew that was coming 2.5 years ago. So they could see the only product they had to sell, which are these CAR T therapies, weren't going to sell. And they didn't have any of the products, although now they've got the obesity drug, so they're happy with that for the time being. So they did the switch. They said, okay, we've got these CAR T therapies. We know how to make them. We're making them in Oxford, and we're making them in Lonza and the other thing. We'll call them vaccines. And then, we won't have to charge $475,000. We could charge a nice, affordable price. And that's what happened. They knew it was going to kill people. When I say they, I mean the big pharma companies did. I'm not sure if the UK government, I don't think if they understood anything about these drugs. They were getting all the PR from the pharma companies, and they could have been believing the big pharma PR that these drugs did work. I don't know, but having got to where they are now, they're not going to admit to anything, are they?
So I just want to, sorry for butting out. I'm very curious about Donald Trump's part in this. I mean, this big, beautiful vaccine from a big, beautiful president and a big, beautiful paycheck at the end of the day. Tell us about Donald Trump. I mean, and by the way, I'm not an anti-Trump person by any stretch, although lately he's been very disappointing, to say the least. But let's go back. Let's warp speed it back to when this all happened. Tell us about his part in it, and his part still, because it's a big, beautiful warp speed. Never been done before. Albert Bueller, what a great guy he is. We'll give you $70-80 billion. I mean, his part in it it's quite questionable, isn't it?
Well, what I would say, looking at Donald Trump, I mean, in his first administration, I was very skeptical. This jury's still out at the moment, but he listens to other people who he thinks know, the people he trusts. And the advice he was getting from Monsir Slaoui was absolutely, unbelievably biased. He was not getting, and he was the advisor on warp speed. And he disappeared. They made up the fact that he was involved in some sexual harassment case, and he basically left the scene. But that guy really was, giving Donald Trump the wrong information. The thing I would say about Donald Trump, what he's done is he's appointed Robert Kennedy Jr. as the head of the HHS. And that's been major. And the biggest thing that he did was to fire Peter Marks. I can't say that too often, because he joined the FDA in 2011, and this whole thing, these CAR T therapies started to come through in 2012, and then 2014 they were given fast track status, etc., etc. So FDA was rogue over that period, and he was waving through all these drugs. We had some high-level resignations when these vaccines were approved, and I can understand why, because basically the people at the lower level, I wouldn't say the lower levels, the people actually doing the real work at FDA are very good at what they do. The inspectors, hugely qualified, they know what they're doing, but of course they were being ignored. And that's how they managed to get this through. I mean, the inspection of the Pfizer plant for the first injections was a nightmare. There was no. I've got the copy of the 80-page inspection report if anyone wants to see it, and the observations. Talking about people climbing underneath equipment to find their pen, and sterility failures, contamination, no control, no quality in checks, no investigation of incidents. So I would say that we've got to depend now on the FDA being a model for the rest of the industry, because what I would say about the US, they got this totally wrong. The PrEP Act and bioweapons and all this sort of stuff with the military involvement. The military weren't involved in this. They may have given a few contracts out, but they wouldn't have a clue how to make these drugs. They wouldn't have a clue. And they may have shipped a few. But so that was all made up in the US, and people believed it. I think there's people out there who've been perpetuating that image that this is a US-centric thing. That's why no one listened to me out there, because they think, oh, but it was the military and they were depopulation. On my Substack, I get people saying, no, you don't understand. This was this was BARDA and all this sort of stuff, and that was cooked up so that to take people off the track, that actually this was big pharma and government bodies, particularly the UK part of this, are doing it.
Well, except Hedley, one of the reasons why there haven't been big court cases is that actually there were legal pathways, there were lawful pathways that go all the way back to 9/11 and the Patriot Act, etc. So I think it's certainly correct that some cases have failed because essentially there were legal pathways set up, and certainly all the regulators and everybody else who's been clucking around pretending that there's some sort of civilian oversight have been allowed to get away with it, and there are reasons for that somewhere. But I think the kindest thing you can say about Donald Trump is that he was set up, he was used as a stooge, he was set up as the fall guy, and it's only that he's so bulletproof and probably narcissistic that he's still 5 years later, trumping the benefits of warp speed. And I suppose if you just look at it as how quickly this thing appeared and they started jabbing people in the arm, it was actually very, very successful. It was a disaster for the health of the poor people that got injected. And there was never any requirement for long-term safety testing because all the governments signed contracts with Pfizer. The fact that they were fraudulent and have resulted in probably criminal activities doesn't seem to have worried anybody yet. But I think all that's going to come.
I don't know.
Could I add just a little bit on the Trump issue? I think in his first, with coming up to the warp speed part, his gut instinct told him that not to trust Fauci and Birx, and he ran into trouble with that. That's why he called in Scott Atlas. Scott Atlas came in and it was reading his book that made me aware just how corrupt the whole system was. And then of course they brought in the vaccine and make sure they only brought the vaccine after he was out of office in case he got any praise for it. Coming back, then he was keen about. He was still had pride that he got warp speed up and running, and until the 2024 campaign, when he started getting booed at his seminar, at his gatherings. And he asked somebody about it, and somebody said that's probably because half the bloody audience has been vaccine injured. And I think this has led to a certain amount of doubt on his part, and part of helped him in his union with RFK Jr. And I think, in actual fact, he will back RFK Jr. I think the baller and the other stuff was more about getting cheap drugs for Americans rather than saying that he's gone the other way.
But he still patted him on the back, didn't he?
Oh yeah. Look,
He did a
Mike,
magnificent job.
he's pretty good at this.
He also patted a
the art of the art
He's
of the deal, wasn't
great
it?
job. Look, I just want to
Yeah.
ask you, as we are running out of time, but we'll keep chatting because I'm enjoying this and I think it's important. If we, Peter, go back to, and I'm going to talk to you about this because I can relate to it because I was in Australia. It was utter chaos. Because I recall when the lockdown started, and I'd never seen anything like this in my entire life. And I thought, wow, this is scary. And our friends, we were all scared. It was, I won't use the entire word, but it was a real cluster, wasn't it? Because
yeah.
the vaxxers, all vaccines, I would imagine, refrigerate. They weren't refrigerated. Then they were out of date. AstraZeneca was pulled, told we can mix boosters, and all this people were still getting the jab and running around like headless chickens. Do you think that was one of the great, the worst times in Australia's history, that we looked to, say, government to lead, and they were complicit in crimes against basically humanity?
Absolutely.
And everything else, nothing made sense. And if you said, I'm not taking the jab, my family still ostracized me. My best friend said I was killing people because we used to interview Peter McCullough and all those, and he won't ever talk to me again. And they still believe that. And I'm just wondering, that period of time, do you think we'll ever get through it? Say in Australia, and I'll ask also Hedley, and I'll ask Matt too. Do you think we'll ever come out of this, out of the other side? Because I don't think we've come out of it yet, because the iterations of new, tempting pandemics, and bird flu, chicken flu, what flew over the cuckoo's nest, all that sort of stuff. It's still there, and they ain't letting that go. So do you think we'll ever come out of it? And it was a terrible time in Australia's history, wasn't it?
Yeah, look, we will come out of it, but what it really requires is what I call a great awakening. We actually need more people to wake up. To me, I was a bit disappointed. I used to think the great Aussie image that I loved was the larrikin, the fellow who doesn't put up with bullshit. And basically, the Australians as a people, if 95% of us were anywhere near that number was vaccinated, then we've fallen for a fair bit of bullshit. But I do think the awakening is happening, but it's happening more slowly here than it's happened in the USA. And that's why I think the critical mass has been reached in the US. There's a certain critical mass of people, once they awake, is going to shift the whole needle. That's my belief.
Matt, what do you think? In the land of the great white cloud, same sort of thing, I would imagine. We had many from New Zealand on, and truly we were parallel, joined at the hip.
Yeah, look, I'd agree with Peter. There is a momentum building. It's unstoppable, frankly, but nobody can say exactly when the dam's going to break, because we're right about the degree of harm, the cancers, the immune failures, all the infections clogging up the hospital, and more people are starting to look back at this single imperative that there was to get the entire country vaccinated, come hell or high water. And in the face of clear and strengthening proof and knowledge by decision makers that actually it was killing and injuring people. And that's a very straightforward sort of pathway in law, as far as I understand. And one of our defenses, and of course Peter and I have been casualties of questioning that imperative to jab come what may, has been that that just the it's actually very hard to talk about when you have the on the ground knowledge of your own family, your own peer group, what you hear is happening elsewhere, just the actual extent of harm. There's an inevitability now to it being very obvious to everybody at some point that's coming. And there's going to be a reckoning, and there will be accountability. But it could get very ugly, because that's human nature. When you compress people in a certain direction for long enough, and then the pressure comes off, or they break free, they tend to lurch in the opposite direction. And we've been overreached and suppressed and silenced and censored for a long time now. And history tells us that it could get very interesting. Either that, or there's going to have to be a long, controlled truth and reconciliation process, in full public view, everything on the table, to kind of let off some of the steam that's built up, because whether you want to blame big pharma, whether you want to go to the many levels above the corporates that seem to be in charge of our elected institutions, or not, it's the people on the ground who we all know, who we see in the supermarket, who we see on the telly, and we know increasingly who these people are and who's responsible. That I wouldn't want to be these people, in the next wee while, because it is inevitable. They can fool around and frighten us with digital ID and things all they like, but history tells us what's going to happen, I'm actually looking forward to getting out the other side of all this.
History does tell us what's going to happen, and Hedley, if you look at what happened to Marie Antoinette, and I don't think she's very healthy at this stage. She needs more than a head transplant. But I'm just thinking, though, the UK, and I agree with Matt. I agree that there is something going to happen. I think we are leading towards, because if we are suppressed enough, I think people will rise up, and those that are thinking, well, we'll just let it go and go, eventually they will break. Hopefully we can do it together. But in the UK, and I'm not surprised anymore, but I was for a while, that there's often talk about you are so close to a revolution, and it could very well be a very unpleasant revolution, and that's because of what Matt said. The good people of the UK, they are being suppressed in just about every part of their life. That was something that made the UK great, that is now to be ashamed of. So if you have all these things happening, and to think that, and I think it was in your book, so it says that we are reading the wrong information. Maybe it's not sexy enough, I don't know, but the information, it's there. And if we had reused basically old vaccines that they knew that would kill, for the sake of a few pennies, bring on that revolution as fast as ever, because I don't believe government, Hedley, I do not believe government will act. You look at in the UK with your grooming gang inquiry, that they're wanting that just to disappear. The severity of that inquiry, you don't need a revolution. It will oust many of the elite. So, and that's not going to happen. So do you think, as Matt said, he believes we're going to come out of the other end, hopefully it's not that end, and that we're going to be able to move forward? Or do you think for that to happen, we need to have a serious conversation with those that are creating this garbage for us? And even your next election, you got Nigel, And truly, I keep saying it, Nigel is a celebrity game show host in waiting. And Farage, that's what he is. So I don't know, unless you have that revolution. Do you think you'll have one? And will we come out of the other end in one piece?
Well, I always talk about the Tony Blair administration in 2001. Under his administration, the MISG was set up, the Ministerial Industry Strategy Group, which is basically a partnership between Big Pharma and government. That was 2001. They've been meeting. I've got all the minutes of the meetings. Up to 2015, they were meeting, and in that group, they were actually, and Jeremy Hunt was in. I've got screenshots of the various people in the meetings, and that's what the UK was trying to do, was to make each government wanted to be, top dog. They wanted to get UK top of the world, and they saw these injections as a way to do that. So they were rushing them through. The MHRA was part of the meetings, and it was all stitched up. And and we've got the digital ID now. There's a big pushback against that. And who's pushing the digital ID but Tony Blair? A raving globalist. And I think that we have to move away from governments trying to use these life sciences or whatever to be top in the world, and just clean the act up. And I think in the UK, the situation is ripe. Everyone hates Starmer. I say everyone. There's probably some people who like him, but gosh, he's in a bad shape over here politically. And there's no obvious alternative. I don't know if Nigel Farage would be able to sort of have enough understanding of what's going on. But I think we need a regime that's not globalist. We need someone who is, who is looking after the UK as a country. Since Tony Blair's time and Maggie Thatcher, we have gone downhill so much. We've privatized everything. That's a joke. Energy, all these things, they're jokes. How can you have competition where you've only got one provider of the base material? Same with telecom, the whole thing. So I think this is all part of the UK going downhill, the City of London and all that sort of stuff. And obviously I haven't got a solution to this, but we do need a political initiative that's going to have a lot of force behind it to make things change.
Mm.
I think in the sense that politics is about people, I agree with you, Hedley, but I think the social contract has been well and truly torn up and trampled. The bargain that we make, we'll elect you and we'll give you our taxes, to run the country in all of our best interests. That's long gone, and I think it would be a mistake for people to look around for the next stooge. I think we need a sort of a ground up hard look at the sort of structures that we that we use to govern us. Are they working? Are the laws still working to protect the common person? These are very big and important questions, and I think it's time that they were examined properly.
Peter, I just got to ask you before we wind this up. Australians they were always known to be, she'll be right, mate. Let's have a beer. Or, Ron, give me a cig. Things like that. And to stop people from smoking, took that away from them, but they live longer. Are they happy? Probably not. But the Australian, it used to be, yeah, she'll be right. Yeah. Some would describe that, however, as apathy. It was just too hard to think about. So do you think, because at the moment, I can tell you that my family, all of them, think I'm a terrible person still because of the path that we're on. And I can probably tell you that I think people think the same thing, won't say it, but if they said, this will keep you alive, shove this up your anus, they would do it. And I think you'd all agree. So are we, is Australia, and you've been around for 20, 30 years, sorry, And you would have seen out of the 19th hole, you would deal with the average Australian. Do you think
Yeah.
do you think we will come out of it? And do you think, here's something for you, do you think we'll be able to hold the people? We whinge about, I mentioned Dan Andrews, we whinge about him, but he's a very wealthy man and he's lauded by governments around the world. So much for accountable. We just whinge about it, then get back to our beer. So do you think we have it in us to, and I certainly hope we do, and if we do then, do you think a revolution is what is required?
Look, I go back to a statement by Augustine of Hippo that said, "Truth is like a lion. You don't have to protect it. It can find its own way." And I do believe that in the end, truth will out. And as that happens slowly but surely, Aussies will wake up and start realising which was bullshit. Because I'm a bit like you. My son, when he was having some friends over who were associated with setting up the Teals, he said, "Now, Dad, be on your best behaviour and none of your nonsense." Anyway, I had a bit of a mistake there and something came out and he said, "Oh, Dad, you're just a right-wing conspiracy theorist and anti-vaxxer." And I had to say, "Mike, that's not fair. You left out climate denier."
You're a terrible person. But look at what happened to Mark Hobart. Look what happened to Mark Hobart. His life is,
Yeah.
I mean, and you couldn't get a better GP. So, and I don't see the Victorian government or the constabulary or any sort of bureaucratic process or people saying, "Mark Hobart, you did a great job. You were what a GP should be." And I never saw that. So I love this country, especially when we're playing cricket against the Poms. But I love the country. But I'm very disappointed in people because there is a group out there, would be 20% maybe, and the others, they're not going to learn because of our attitude. She'll be right, mate. Trust the government. Gentlemen, I have to say this has been magnificent. Thank you very much. Dr. Matt Shelton, Hedley Rees, and Dr. Peter Johnson, highly intelligent people, and I feel quite humble. I mean, I used to get bocked in the ear because I wouldn't take notes at school. But thank you very much. You've educated me, enjoyed it immensely. And I've got to thank our audience too. We have a guy, I mentioned him last night, but I think it's really cool. I think he's American, lives in Alaska, but they're very close to Russia. Because it's a very cold part of the world. And I always picture David, who writes in a lot to us, going outside, cutting a hole in the ice in his Speedos, of course, and diving in and grabbing a fish and coming out with the fish in his mouth. That's how I picture it. But I keep being told that's what seals do, not what people do. Gentlemen, thank you very much. Thank you to our audience. I appreciate it. This is The World Today, and this is The Protagonist.